we're gonna have a lot of fun today. So I hope you're ready to have some fun as well. Big thing though, I'm gonna need you guys to do a few safety reminders before we begin. I need you to keep your hands, arms, and legs inside your chair at all times. And I need no smoking as well, please. And no flash photography, the animatronics don't like that. All right, shall we begin? Again, a quick thing on me, as she said, I'm a former news anchor on 1590 AM KLIV, host of the TV series Lost Parks of Northern California, a documentary producer with American Coaster Enthusiasts, a volunteer with the National Roller Coaster Museum and Archives in Plainview, Texas, and goodness, if that wasn't enough, I also sell roller coasters on the side. So, quite a dichotomy, I know. I work at the library, and then I sell roller coasters afterwards. That's my life, everybody. So, let's start, because you came here today to learn about the thrills and innovation that have made North Texas the leader in amusement parks for several decades. So let's just dive right into things, starting with parks right here in Fort Worth. This is one a lot of people are familiar with. It's Lakewood Park, better known as Casino Beach, though. It's the crown jewel of this park was the Thriller. It is a beautiful wooden roller coaster designed by the legendary engineer John Miller of the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, or PTC, as they're known in some of the enthusiast angles. They've been building carousels, coasters, and other rides now for over 120 years, and to this day, they are still building coaster trains. If they're watching, hi Tom, hi Janine, they own the company. This ride is known as an out and back because it goes out from the station and then it comes back. Pretty simple, right? Now, for my park fans, I want you to check out the double down at the end there, at the backside. That is a wicked amount of airtime. For those who are not familiar, airtime is that sensation where you kind of lift off the seat and you get that little weird pit in your stomach. Ride enthusiasts live for that moment. So, this is back in the 1920s. That's quite a pop of air, to say the least. So it ran, by the way, from 1921 to 1959-ish. Here's an overview of it, as you can see. Now, here's kind of an interesting fun fact. 21 years after this ride first opened, or rather was demolished, a new Woody would open up in the Metroplex, right down the street, that has a very striking, similar appearance to it. Who's been on Judge Roy Scream at Six Flags Over Texas? If you notice very much, it's a very similar look. The hills are a little bit higher at the beginning, but it is practically the exact same layout. Now, whether or not it was inspired by that, can't necessarily say, because this design's very generic and very common for its time. They like to repeat a lot of designs because it was a lot easier to build the same ride somewhere, as opposed to try to re-engineer something on site, which was done, however. Let's talk about Lake Como Park. It had a coaster as well. It was called a Figure 8. We don't know exactly when or where it actually operated from. They call it a side friction roller coaster for a reason. Think of a log ride. Now take away the water. That's what a side friction roller coaster is like. These cars are not actually locked onto the track, so they could just fly right off. You can see there might be a bit of a safety issue with that in modern times. There's actually one still around, and it's called Leap the Dips in Altoona, Pennsylvania. That's what it looks like. That's what it would have looked like at Lake Como Park. They're all, again, very similar designs. As you can see, it just rides on the trough there, and there are several hills, and for those who have been on Leap the Dips, there are a few of you, I assume, it jumps, there's a little bit of air. Yeah, okay. Perfectly normal, but really exciting for those who are the uninitiated that all of a sudden, oh, goodness, we're off the track for a moment. Unfortunately, this design, very dated as you can imagine. You can't really do a whole lot of exciting things with this. This ride is currently closed. We're not sure when it's going to reopen. The current owners of the park in Pennsylvania don't have the money to maintain it or insure it. However, it is a National Historic Landmark, so that does offer some protection for the attraction. So that was in Lake Como Park here in Fort Worth, if you can believe it. White City at Rosen Heights also had a Figure 8. It ran from about 1906 to 1912. Don't really have a lot of definitive dates or a name for this one. It was probably just called Coaster, to be honest. It was located at the intersection of Jacksboro Highway and Ephraim Avenue, or 183 and 199 by modern terms. So if anyone has the Planet Fitness membership, there was a roller coaster literally behind the Planet Fitness. Again, these are all parks that were here and they just disappeared and people seem to have forgotten about them, which is unfortunate because they're really special. So there wasn't a whole lot of information that we could find on a lot of these parks, mostly because when they were bulldozed, that was it. Didn't really care, kind of lost that history rather quickly. It wasn't seen as being worthy of preservation at the time, unlike today. Forest Park, back in the day, from 1965 through about the 1980s, had a wild mouse roller coaster, which was named so far because it had very darting maneuvers and it looked like a mouse was running and scurrying around. Didn't have a lot of banking where, it sort of lean into a turn. It didn't have that, and you'll see that in a couple of the photos here. It closed, the ride did, when the Fort Worth Zoo expanded. However, you can still ride the miniature train that was at Forest Park because it's still there. Now, there is some evidence that the ride that you see here was actually from Six Flags over Texas. There was a ride there called La Cucaracha, which was a small little wild mouse coaster. It lasted for 1 year and then was replaced by the employee cafeteria. But there's no evidence to say that it necessarily was, but there's also not enough evidence to say that it wasn't the same ride. So I'm going to show you guys another shot of this. Talking about that banking, you see there's absolutely none of it, which is lovely. And it also has a very small car, fit maybe 1 to 2 people. Well, nowadays it's only 1 person. So they upgraded this from the second half of that ride is the original, and then they added more to it to make it what's called a monster mouse. Now, I don't want to say that they aren't exciting, but you can still ride something just like this at Wonderland up in Amarillo. So take that 5-hour drive up 287, and as you can see by the white knuckles, it's a very tame ride. But you'll also notice that there's no restraint system. Yep. That's why you have the white knuckles. Again, perfectly safe, but it's a different time, a different era in terms of insurance, and Texas was right there at the forefront of it. And to this day, really still is. Paul Borchardt and Paula, who own this park, Wonderland, have done an amazing job of maintaining this ride. In fact, it is the only wild mouse that I know of that era from the 1940s that has magnetic braking, which is a very new innovation. Mistake me if I'm wrong, there's only 2 of these ones left, and the other one's in Lakeside in Colorado, in Denver. So, again, amazing. So, all right, I know, guys, we got to go to the other side of the Metroplex. We got to talk about Dallas. But the good news is, would you believe it if I told you that Fort Worth has bested Dallas in one very important category? Amusement parks with roller coasters. We got more than they did, ever. We had 4, and Dallas only had 1. And you probably know it. It's the State Fair of Texas. Now, all kidding aside, it actually has had several very unique attractions over the years. The first one that we're going to talk about is this very unique triple racing roller coaster. Now, this is unusual because it was built in the 1930s. This is a time of the Great Depression. There's not a lot of money going around, and people really necessarily don't want to have fun because they have no money to spend. They're waiting in line for bread and soup at this point. But this ride was actually built at that time, so that makes it a very rare attraction. It was also very rare because it wasn't very well designed. What you see is what you get. It looks like a giant figure 8 there, and that's the whole ride. There's 1 drop, 2 drops, 3 drops, and then you run into the station. Well, the problem is that they didn't give enough room in the plot of land that they were given to build out a proper brake run and station. So what ended up happening is the ride would go through its circuit, and as it would come into the station, it would just kind of keep going up the lift hill until it stopped. And that's when you got off. Why? Look, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So you had this plot of land to fit this much ride into it. Okay, I can do that. It was torn down in 1947 when the larger and much longer Comet would debut at the State Fair of Texas. Continuing on to the State Fair of Texas, you have the State Fair Comet, which I think a lot of people may remember here. Ran from 1947 all the way to 1985. It closed in 1985 when the State Fair was unable to secure an insurance carrier for the ride, which is, of all the possible ways for a ride to close, this has to be one of the weirdest. I've never seen anything like it. It's usually the park can't maintain it, it's too expensive, land value got too much. None of that happened here. This was literally no insurance carrier would cover the ride. So the ride sat for 4 years while preservationists tried to save it, and unfortunately it didn't happen, and the ride shut down in 1989. Here's another shot. It's a beautiful ride. This was known as a double out and back. I'll give you a guess why. Because it went out and back twice, exactly. Great ride from what I can see. I never got a chance to ride it. There are some in the room who have, and it was quite the ride and quite the experience. And it was really unique because it's a ride that is sitting at the State Fair all year and doesn't run until the State Fair, and that's where it made all its money. And it was able to run all the way through because of that. So, and it wasn't that the ride was unsafe. Far from it. It's just the insurance didn't want to cover it back in the day. But the State Fair is not quite done. There's another very unique and very important attraction to talk about, and that is Looping Star, which was built back in 1979 at the Schwarzkopf Company in Munsterhausen, Germany. It is the world's first portable looping roller coaster. Now, sounds crazy. Now it's like, oh, that's no big deal. There's so many different thrill rides that show up at the State Fair that do all sorts of looping and things. In the 1970s, this was incredible, that you could find a ride that was not only this large, but able to do this much dynamic force, especially a vertical loop. It used a very large water tank as ballast underneath the ride to hold the loop down. It's pretty brilliant. It traveled the German fair circuit for 2 years because Germany is awesome. And then eventually it moved to the United States and was purchased by Jolly Roger Amusement Park, which is at Ocean City, Maryland, at the end of Highway 50. It was bought then by the State Fair of Texas in 1981 and ran for several seasons. And here's the best part. You can still ride this coaster today if you drive up Interstate 35 right now at Frontier City in Oklahoma. So here's the ride back in the 80s. As you can see, there's the Comet in the background, and you can definitely tell the dated because you can see the type of vehicles in the parking lot. And here it is today at Frontier City. Brand new paint, brand new trains, actually repainted trains. They're still the original trains.
Water tank is still there.
And you see that, exactly, thank you, Chris. So that giant water tank at the bottom of the loop there, that's just ballast to hold the loop down. And in addition to that, it actually holds the whole structure down because it's all interconnected. So it's like one big counterweight that holds it right there. But at the same time, this ride could come down in 7 days and be moved and rebuilt in 10. Very impressive engineering for its day. And even today, when you think about it, the fact that you all are shocked that you can do that, yes. And there are rides that have 5 loops that will go down in 7 days and be built in 10. That still travels the German fair circuit. In fact, at one point, State Fair of Texas tried to get that roller coaster, but was denied. Again, here it is back in the 1980s. And here it is now, again at Frontier City. And today, there's the actual train that you saw in that first shot at the National Roller Coaster Museum, awaiting a bath and restoration. All right. Catch up on my stuff there. So now that we've gone through our Texas parks, the Dallas parks and our Fort Worth parks, let's talk a little bit about everything in between, because the Metroplex is obviously a very large space, and some of us have been here quite a while. Some of us have maybe just moved in. So let's take a look at some of them, past and present. Let's start with one that a lot of people have forgotten about, which is Sesame Place in Irving. It was located off of Esters Road and Airport Freeway, or 183, in Irving, opened in 1982 and closed 2 years later in 1984. It might have actually been too far ahead of its time. It had several different playground elements. It had interactive computer exhibits for 1982, and it had an animatronic Oscar the Grouch. Today, we would call this sort of thing a family entertainment center, or an FEC for short. And what's kind of incredible is that these are exploding right now around the country. For example, the Legoland Discovery Center in Grapevine Mills Mall has a very similar idea behind this, and yet it's quite successful. So Sesame Place may have been about 3 decades too early, but it was there, and the innovation from Texas was here for that. It may also be a problem that to enter the park, you had to go through Big Bird's mouth. Not sure if many kids wanted to do that. Just saying. There is the animatronic Oscar the Grouch doing his thing. Let's see if it goes. Oh, it did.
Sesame Place, the family place to play and learn together. Share it with your family soon.
What's also incredible is that Sesame Places now are popping up all across the country. And they're doing a lot more rides and attractions as opposed to playing, learning, and education, although there was an education element to it. But it really started here in Irving. Sandy Lake Park, very tiny, very small family-owned park located in Carrollton, opened in 1971 by Tom and Susie Self, along with Susie's brother, Frank, and his wife, Vicki. It was located in Carrollton, Texas, next to Sandy Lake, hence the name. It was featured in it had several different carnival rides, a train, and a very large swimming pool, which was very much in style back in the day. Right now, though, it's closed and basically abandoned. The family in 2018 said it just felt like the right time to sell, which, given what we've gone through in the past 4 years, seems kind of fortuitous, to say the least. So again, very small, family-owned park. These are disappearing rapidly, not just in the Metroplex, but across the country. So it's a bit of a crisis in the industry right now. So we're hoping that we can get those parks back up to where they were, because that's where the small little innovations began and spread out throughout the rest of the industry. And a lot of them, again, right here in North Texas. Who remembers Lion Country USA? Oh, I'd love to see those hands up. It was open from 1972 to 1991. It was the drive-through safari experience where all the animals were free roaming and you stayed in your car. No convertibles were allowed. Park suffered from a few major issues, specifically an ice storm in 1978 that killed off 50 of its animals. And then it was discovered that the animals that died were being used to feed the animals that survived. Not good PR, to say the least. Also, back-to-back floods in 1989 and 1990 killed over 50 animals and caused $2 million in damage to the facility. It just wasn't going to be able to recover from something like that. Don't scratch the paint, please, on my brand new, is that Oldsmobile? Nice. So again, this really cool experience. If you never got a chance to do them, they are very unique, but they're also pretty rare for obvious reasons. Driving around with a bunch of lions, not necessarily, talk about insurance risks, the most of the thing anymore. So you might be asking yourself, well, then what happened to Lion Country USA? It's just a nice little park now, right? No, that's Lion Country USA right now. It's a warehouse district. So I go back to, these are important to talk about and important to remember, because when they're gone, they can be erased forever. The only thing that remains is Lion Country Parkway and Wildlife Parkway. That's the only things left. Everything else, completely gone. That's what it looks like now. So right off of Beltline Road and Interstate 30 north. Right by the big Ford dealership, if you go north of that. Yeah, that's exactly where it would be. So let's talk about the big dog. That would be Six Flags Over Texas. Opened in 1961 by Angus G. Wynn, who was a local developer. He realized that both Dallas and Fort Worth were eventually going to meet together, and they were going to meet in the middle in Arlington. So he had visited Disneyland back in 1955 and thought, Texas should have something like this. Why can't it have something like this? I should build something like this. So he did. The park was supposed to be open for just 10 years because Wynn figured that the land there was not ready. There wasn't enough utilities available. He needed the land to develop first to make it more valuable so he could sell it off eventually and put warehouses. Well, it turns out Wynn made way more money at the theme park than he ever did making warehouses, so the park stayed around. So, in fact, it was so successful, he opened 2 more parks just outside St. Louis and just outside Atlanta, Six Flags Over Georgia and Six Flags Over Mid-America. Today, the chain is over 20 parks. It's got water parks. It's got parks that Wynn never actually built. Those were the only 3 he ever did. So it's quite large. There are many firsts at Six Flags Over Texas, and there are several lasts at the time now. For example, this is the first Six Flags park that we have in Arlington. It is the first one to use pay one price admission. Back in the day, even Disneyland, have you ever heard of an e-ticket? You had ticket books you would buy. You would pay for admission to get in, and then you would pay for each ride. Angus decided, why don't I just pay one price and you get everything? Ride as much as you want, go and see all the shows you want. Food was different, but everything else you got to get in for essentially for free. So it was a huge value, and that spread throughout the industry. In fact, Disneyland copied eventually the Six Flags model because it was easier and it was less managing having to have a person at the front taking someone's ticket or a kid running out of tickets and couldn't ride the attraction. Just jump on, it's fine. They're also the first to feature Broadway-style shows in the Southern Palace. It was the first log flume ever built, El Aserradero, which is still there to this day. It is the first runaway mine train roller coaster and second tubular steel roller coaster ever built behind Disneyland and the Matterhorn bobsleds. It had the very first speed racer roller coaster ever built, which we'll go into that in a little bit. The first modern parachute drop outside of Coney Island was built at Six Flags Over Texas. The first free fall attraction was built at Six Flags Over Texas. There's a lot of people here having PTSD from that. The first iBox track roller coaster, the new Texas Giant, designed from the old Texas Giant, was built, and currently is one of only 2 mini mine trains still left in existence in the world, and the last remaining Swiss Bob roller coaster in the world is at Six Flags Over Texas. And all my ace friends, you're not allowed to answer this. Can anyone name the ride here in that photo? Any of my other friends? I know everyone's holding their breath. Anybody? No? Skyhook. It was around just before the oil derrick was built as a way to get people up into the breeze. And when Angus realized that he could have more capacity with the oil derrick, he decided to build that. But a fun story about that, he was approached by a Swiss company who said, we want to build an Eiffel Tower. It's an observation deck. It's exactly what you need. Angus looked at him and said, why would I build an Eiffel Tower in my amusement park about Texas? Build me an oil derrick. So they did. 2 more models of that exact same ride do exist at Kings Island and Kings Dominion in Ohio and Virginia, respectively. They are the actual Eiffel Towers, but if you look at all 3 photos, the skeleton, the core of the ride, is exactly the same. El Aserradero, the world's first log flume. That's right, we had it first. Before Splash Mountain, before any of those other water rides, we had it first. When they were testing, they had realized that they had made a critical error and that the run out at the end of the ride, or if you go down the big drop, was too short. And so the boats kept bumping at the end. So they thought, well, how can we slow this down? We can't just re-engineer the whole thing. It's got to be open soon. So they just made the pool deeper at the bottom. Well, there was a small problem with that. As soon as they hit, there were splashes. They were terrified. These people are going to get wet on this ride. They can't do that. First day it opened, it was well over 85 degrees. It's a 3-hour wait. And they suddenly realized people wanted to get wet to cool down. Hence, the modern log ride was born. There is an actual test photo of the ride back in Mountain View, California. And that's Aero trying to figure out all the water flow. Remember, all these equations and everything have not been figured out yet. They had to figure it all out first, and it was done on this ride. So when you ride Flume 1, as it's known now, it's got a little bit of jank to it. It's a little rough, but that's because they were still kind of figuring everything out. And when you ride Flume 2, which is right next to it, you can notice that it's a little bit different. It's a little bit smoother. That's because of all the engineering, and they kind of figured out how it worked after that. It's kind of what you do with prototype rides. The Runaway Mine Train, classic family coaster built by Texan Ron Toomer, who lived in Bedford. The right side, you'll see a tunnel there. That tunnel unfortunately collapsed in an ice storm back in the day, and so we've always been trying to get them to build it back up. This was Ron's very first roller coaster. He had never designed one before, and he designed one as iconic and good as Runaway Mine Train. That is impressive. It has definitely stood the test of time. 2 defunct rides here. The Big Bend, which was the speed racer roller coaster where you had, as we call it, date night seating, because there was you were very close to someone if you were in there. It had a cool spiral lift, so it didn't have like the traditional chain lift. It went up a big spiral, and it had very sweeping curves, low to the ground. Very thrilling experience. And then the Shootout, which was the first modern parachute drop. Does anyone know how the parachute drop was retired? It was retired in style.
They blew it up?
Yeah, they pretty much cut it with explosives at the bottom and let it fall down. Park was closed. Calm down, everybody.
This is the second Intamin ride that they blew up.
Mm-hmm. And here's the first one. The Wildcatter, or the Texas Cliffhanger. This is the world's first free fall attraction. This was a true free fall. You actually legitimately fell down. It's okay, the camera's pointed this way, not that way. How many people did the penny trick? How many people are not familiar with the penny trick? How many people just don't want to answer because it's too early? Okay. Penny trick was you would take a penny as you were sitting on the ride, and you put it on your knee, and you watched it float as you fell, and then donated the money to Six Flags because it fell through everything and fell to the bottom of the ride. I think that those donations probably paid for the ride the first year, just in loose
They
change.
bought a whole lot of employee dinners.
Yes, they did. And it had a very unique noise to this thing as well. There's a lot of metal on metal contact. It's very unique, to say the least. There's only 3 of these left in the world. But Six Flags Over Texas and DFW, we had the first one. And there is one of the original cars that sits up at the National Roller Coaster Museum. As you can see, not much for restraints. It's just one big over-the-shoulder restraint. That's it. The car kind of kept you in the rest of the way. And it had a very nice grading on the bottom, so you could look down and then look all the way down the ground. It was just evil. I love it, though. It's great. Who remembers Seven Seas? Awesome. It opened in 1972. It was pretty difficult to operate in the shadow of Six Flags and the newly created Texas Rangers. So unfortunately, after 3 years, the park really wasn't doing that well. Most of the animals sold off in 1975. Park did briefly reopen as Hawaii Kai, almost like a water park and restaurant type thing, but it ultimately closed soon thereafter. Now here's the cool part. You can still see parts of Seven Seas at the Arlington Sheraton pool area. In fact, parts of the Japanese garden and the pagoda are still there. I would strongly suggest that you go see them sooner rather than later. The Arlington Sheraton is scheduled for demolition in the next year or two. Here's an overlook of the very first Arlington Entertainment District. As you can see there, you've got your new stadium there, Seven Seas right next to it, and then Six Flags Over Texas just past that. If you've been by Six Flags recently, you know that that area to the right of the oil derrick has seen quite a bit of additional work and new attractions in there. So it's kind of cool to see that. And did anybody remember going down the old oil derrick slide? Congratulations, you've cheated death. It wasn't necessarily the best idea. It opened the first year without a roof, a hot tin slide. Yeah. And then after that, if you didn't grease it just right, then you would go flying and you would get airtime that you did not want. I would encourage you to check out the WFAA collection on YouTube because there are tons of great photos and video of the park. And one of them is of the slide, and whew, there's people walking around, they're just going like this. Afterwards, it's hilarious. Well, I can't do a discussion about Texas-sized thrills without sort of expanding a little bit outside of DFW, without mentioning one very specific park that was just down Interstate 45, and that was beloved Astroworld. It opened from 1968 to 2005, and it was built as the larger part of the Astrodome complex by former Mayor Ray Hoffhines. It closed primarily for 2 reasons: mounting debt from the company that purchased it, and which had also purchased many other parks around the world, so it over-leveraged itself. It also didn't own its own parking lot, and that contributed significantly to it as well. It's now, the site is used just for overflow parking for the rodeo and Houston Texans. Now, I don't know about you guys, I'd much rather see a theme park there than an overflow parking lot that's barely used. But there it is. That's where there's the Astroworld, as you can see. You cross the bridge, and then there is the park. Quite a bit of innovation as well at Astroworld, specifically Ultra Twister. I can see everybody's stomach already churning, right? It turns out, despite what this guy's face looks like, it was a quite enjoyable experience. It was very smooth for its time. And what it did is it wasn't able to do turns, so it did switchbacks. So it would go up a vertical lift, up and over, vertical drop, a little bounce with quite a bit of floating air, and then it would do a heart line, which means that the track was turned around your heart so that it didn't hurt. It's very much similar to a zero-G maneuver when you're in a plane, but just in a straight line as opposed to a parabolic arc. Then it would stop, it would tilt the track backwards, and then you fall backwards to go do it because you can't do a turn. It would do 2 more heart lines, and then it went into the station. So I want to call it a one-trick pony, but boy, for its time, it was really advanced. Yeah, he really isn't having a good time, is he? The Texas Cyclone. This was a clone or a copy of the actual Coney Island Cyclone, but taller and faster because everything's bigger in Texas. Many will say that this was probably, of all the copies that were built, the best one. At the very end, it was running in the best possible shape. And like I said, it is an exact copy with the exception of it's a little bit taller and a little bit faster. When the ride finished its last ride in 2005, as the park was closing, the last train stopped, they busted out the chainsaws, and they cut out a whole section of track, which is also at the museum today. We've mounted up there. Those are not actually the trains, but they are to demonstrate the 3 road trains that would have been on it. But there's the actual physical track as it was in 2005 when they cut it out. Then it was put on a trailer and it was towed up to the museum in Plainview, Texas. You can imagine the looks we got as it was driving there, and the looks when we towed it back into the museum. When we brought it back into the museum, there were 2 inches of clearance on either side to get this thing, and we were using pallet jacks to move it because it had to be so precise. And if sharp eyes will spot back there that Texas flag on that coaster, that is from the original wooden Texas Giants. Okay. So Chris, this is all fun going down nostalgia and kind of learning about this stuff. But why is this actually important? It's important for several reasons. First of which, that Texas has led the way in the attractions industry for decades with new innovative rides and different experiences that have not only stood the test of time, but have changed the attractions industry forever. If El Aserradero was not built at Six Flags Over Texas, the log ride may not be a thing. Can you imagine a theme park without a log ride? Not necessarily. Can you imagine a park without a family roller coaster? A large park? Probably not. But if it wasn't for what happened here, we would have never had that. We should be celebrating this type of history and embracing it because not only is it unique, but it's special. It's something that we should be prideful of. These are also experiences that you can only get in an amusement park. It's a shared communal event. Name another place where you can go with 28 strangers and all do the exact same thing together, and it's perfectly normal to scream. You can't. But you jump on a roller coaster train and like, oh yeah, this is gonna be fun. We're gonna have fun. And you know that. How cool is that to be able to share it? It's a visceral event. It's something that a virtual experience simply cannot replicate. My apologies to the Zoom audience for not being here today. But watching videos about amusement parks is fun. Experiencing them with friends and family, way more fun. And that's what brings us together as a community and as a family to be able to enjoy that experience together. You can't bring your phone out on a ride. But you know what you can do? Put your hands up as you're sitting next to your dad as he's telling you to go on this ride because you're gonna have a ton of fun. That was me in 1993 when I was terrified of roller coasters. And my dad, sitting with my dad on a shuttle ride that shot you out of the station. You did a big vertical loop, and then you did a loop backwards and back into the station. And it changed my life forever. I would not be here today if it wasn't for that ride. Because I would just be doing nothing, having a boring life. Instead, I get to hang out with you all. I moved here to Texas because of that opportunity, and I could not be more thankful of it. And also, we're losing a lot of family-owned parks. You know, you see a lot of the corporatization of the world these days. Family parks are no different. And we've already lost Joyland in Lubbock. The Dean family decided to sell. You've got Sandy Lake Park, and who knows, there may be others in Texas that are struggling as well. So supporting those family-owned businesses, even at a theme park, is really, really important because it's disappearing. It's a very rare opportunity. And in Texas, we have so many great parks that people need to necessarily drive a little out of their way for, but it's absolutely worth it. So some additional resources here if you want to check this out. As Linda had said, I'm a member of American Coaster Enthusiasts. You can visit them there. The National Roller Coaster Museum, which is still under construction in Plainview, Texas. You can check out all their stuff there. And then Amusement Today, which is local. All three of these, by the way, have a presence in the Metroplex. So strongly suggest to check these out, learn more about the industry, learn more how you can support it, and learn more about the history behind this industry. It's so unique. There are so many stories. You know, we go out every Wednesday night, a group of us here, and we just talk. And there are so many great stories out there that need to be told. It's a very oral tradition type of industry. I could go on and on with it's like AI. Give me a prompt, I'll tell you a story. Lord knows there's a story behind something. But again, to be able to check that out, and it's so special, it really is important. So with that, before I keep droning on, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, do we have any questions for Kris?
I remember late 50s, early 60s storyline. Stories of Santa. Was it another? Was that? I don't remember if they had lives. I just remember going. I thought it was HEB or was it? I thought it was.
There's a good chance there's a couple smaller parks that I wasn't able to include in the presentation for time, but absolutely, and I've seen a lot of other faces nodding with it, so I'll assume you weren't crazy. Yes, you absolutely, that it was definitely a thing, for sure. Yes, sir?
Two questions. First one, when you said that you rode a shuttle loop,
Yes.
from California, was that Montezuma's Revenge?
I've been on Montezuma's Revenge, but no, that is the tidal wave at Great America in Santa Clara, California.
Oh, okay.
So it is no longer with us either.
You can
So.
still find some supports there.
There, you can still find, there are still some, the unique thing about with the attractions industry is that sometimes rides never leave you. There are still supports or footers or bolts and pieces that just sort of stay. So that's one of the rides where there are still support structures for it still at the park. Who remembers the Big Bend at Six Flags Over Texas? You got to look carefully, but there is still one or two footers, cement footers for the ride that are still in the park to this day. It's obviously a lot cheaper just to leave them there than it is to jackhammer them out because they're not doing any harm, just sitting there doing nothing. Oh, yes, sorry. The question was, for the Zoom audience, talked about a shuttle loop, and what was that shuttle loop? So it was the tidal wave in Santa Clara, California.
And then my second question, since Six Flags, thank you. Since Six Flags and Cedar Point have announced a merger, we're hearing Disneyland, like Disney is once again increasing ticket prices. Universal Studios, same thing, is going to have to compete now that they're opening their new parks. Do you think this is an opportunity for family-owned, smaller amusement parks to step in and fill the gap, since essentially these theme parks are getting priced out for a lot of people?
So the question, just in case you didn't hear on Zoom, was with the mergers of Six Flags and Cedar Fair and the Disney and Universal prices going up again and again, do you think this is an opportunity for the family-owned parks to sort of fill a niche and possibly see a renaissance? I hope so. I really do. I think there's a niche for a park that is economical and good quality. And you see that in a lot of the family-owned parks, for sure. So they can't build a $25 million roller coaster. They don't need to. They just need to provide a great experience that you can tell a lot of love went into it. Not to say a $25 million ride wouldn't be hated, but it's just out of the economic reality of a thing. Makes sense. Great quick story about that. Back in the day, 4 different parks got together, family-owned parks, and they bought in bulk a dark ride. which became Fantastic Journey at Wonderland in Amarillo. So they all pooled their money resources together to buy a ride that normally they would not be able to afford. But because they were able to build 4 of them at the same time, they got economy of scale. So they worked together to make that work. And they are definitely of their time, but they're still a cool snapshot in history of where they were at that time.
Okay, we've got a Zoom question. What's the weirdest urban legend you've heard about Six Flags?
I used to work there. I think most of the people here have worked here at some point or another. I think the one that everyone knows about is Annie the Ghost. I never met her, but I know some people who have. That's about the weirdest one that I've heard. I'll tell you another good story, though, because I'm full of them. So when Angus was building the park, he decided that he was going to name it Texas under Six Flags, because these 6 nations that ruled over Texas. Well, Mrs. Wynn didn't like that, because Mrs. Wynn thought Texas isn't under anybody. So the name was changed to Six Flags over Texas. And you can actually see that in some of the original artwork for the park. It says Texas under Six Flags. So it's kind of a fun little cool tidbit there. There's some other stories that I'm probably never allowed to tell, but that's a whole nother story. That's what you get when you work in this industry. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Talk about the roller coaster museum in Plainview. I've not heard of that.
I'm not surprised. So the National Roller Coaster Museum and Archives, we've been under construction for probably about 20 years now, just trying to raise funds to do it. It's right next to a roller coaster factory that is built in West Texas. And didn't know that either, did you? So if you've ever been to a carnival and you've seen those big loops,
Even Six Flags have.
even Six Flags have, yeah. Those are built in West Texas. So are tilt-a-whirls. Have you ever been on a tilt-a-whirl before? That's from West Texas at Larson International. So they have helped us out build a museum where we can store all these incredible artifacts like you've seen out there. So our goal is to eventually be open to the public and sort of showcase all these incredible attractions and the history behind them. Because normally what would happen is these rides would eventually sit in the boneyard of the park, and eventually they get picked apart for pieces or maybe a display for something. Inevitably, they go to the dump. They're not historic. At least that's what they thought. So we've lost countless different vehicles to the dump. So at one point, about 25 to 30 years ago, American Coaster Enthusiasts said, we need to have a museum to preserve this, similar to like a trolley museum or a car museum. Yeah, the cars don't necessarily work anymore, but they tell a story. So I recommend, just if you want to hang out a little bit after, I can give you a bit more on the museum, because Lord knows, between myself and about everybody in the front rows here, they'll talk to you about the museum all day. But that's what we've been trying to do for about 20 years now. And we've got the about 20,000 square foot facility built now. And so we're just working to build out the interior of it so that it has a nice display, so it's not necessarily a warehouse. And then we'll be able to actually showcase all that incredible ride history, a lot of which did come from Six Flags. We have one of the shootout chutes. We have obviously the Wildcatter car. We have a car from the Coney Island Cyclone, which was retired for maintenance. And the Matterhorn bobsleds. We have a second generation Matterhorn bobsled car. We are one of the few places that actually have Disney attraction vehicles outside of Disney in the wild. Disney does not like to give those up for obvious reasons. But they were kind enough to donate us several different vehicles, some of which we'll be able to talk about hopefully soon. Another couple of notable things just out there, we have a train from Montezuma's Revenge that came out recently, as well as the Top of the Loop when that ride was retired. Goodness, I'll just go through all my collection there. And our oldest vehicle is from 1911, and amazingly has a restraint, a very rudimentary restraint device, but it has a lap bar. Most of the rides back in the day of that era did not have lap bars. It had a grab bar, hence the term white knuckle, because you'd be grabbing and holding on for dear life. Mind you, the 1920s and the 19-teens were kind of an era where when a ride got a reputation for being dangerous, it had a longer line. Nowadays, it's shut down by the state.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Can you bring the mic to you?
Give me one second.
In bio, you said you sell roller coasters.
Yes.
Who do you sell them to? Sort of a niche market.
Do you want to buy one? No, the question was that on the side I do sell roller coasters, yes. And so, of course, I joke, yeah, would you like to buy one? It depends on whoever, whatever facility wants to put one in. We've had rides go in at the Galveston Pleasure Pier, Six Flags, Cedar Point, even small little parks like Circuit of the Americas. Don't know if you knew, there's a new amusement park opening soon at Circuit of the Americas, Codaland, very well named. But it's right there at the racetrack, and it's going to all be race themed. So it really depends on what type of attraction that you were looking for and what size, and sky's the limit.
Since you were asked earlier about the National Roller Coaster Museum and Archives, is there a chance that there could be a similar session like this just on the National Roller Coaster Museum?
I'm looking, so the question was, is there possible to do another session about the museum? That would be up to TCU at some point, so you can talk to them in the back about that, and they would.
Hint, hint.
But we appreciate the love regardless, so. I'm just excited to be able to share with you all just the incredible history that surrounds us, that you may not necessarily think as you're driving by Interstate 30 thinking, oh, those are historic rides. You just think, oh, they're just rides. But it turns out they've actually had huge impacts on the industry and on all of us as Americans.
I have another question.
Sure.
So, since Six Flags does claim to have the first iBox design, which
Yes.
was the Rocky Mountain coasters upgrade, renovation of the Texas Giant.
Yes.
What's your take on RMC redoing so many classic wooden coasters? Obviously, the other wooden coaster here in Texas was Rattler down at Fiesta, Texas. Gwazi out of Busch Gardens in Florida was another major change. Do you like these upgrades, or do you feel that's taken away from the classic and iconic wooden roller coaster?
So the question was, there is a company out of Idaho that renovates older wooden roller coasters into a steel design. It's a bit more modern, a bit more thrilling, and it's a lot less on maintenance costs. Wooden roller coasters obviously take quite a bit more time and effort to maintain than a steel coaster does. So the question was, well, how do I feel about that? You know, it hasn't to the point that that company has taken on a truly historic roller coaster. It's taken on larger ones or notable ones, but not ones that have been either recognized as being historic or really have significant historic value to them. A lot of them were just so big that they lasted about a year and then they got unrideable. So if it breathes new life into an existing ride as opposed to tearing it down completely, I'm okay with it. I'm perfectly fine with it. I think if you saw Texas Giant and you rode it before it was changed, it was an experience, okay? And it wasn't necessarily a positive one. But now, it's an hour-and-a-half line sometimes to ride New Texas Giant. It's a fun ride. It's a thrilling ride. It's a ride that the whole family can still enjoy. It's just a lot smoother than what it used to be. But I do recall our GM at the time, Steve Martindale, saying, you know, I couldn't see us having a Six Flags Over Texas without a Texas Giant. But we can't keep up, you know, the original Giant the way it was. It was just too big. And history's kind of proven that the rides that are over 100, 120 feet on Woodies, they don't necessarily last because they're so hard on the structure and the track. Yet you see these rides that are like 70, 80 feet tall, they're still around, they're still kicking butt. In fact, they're all in the top 10. So even though you necessarily don't want the tallest, fastest wooden roller coaster, you want the best. So you don't want an EST coaster, as our friend Tim Baldwin likes to say. You want the best. BEST. That isn't the EST. Never mind. You get the drift.
Any other questions? Okay, so I actually do have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Your comment about the splash at the end of the log ride made me think about how when I was a kid going to Six Flags, I remember my mom always making sure that I wore something we didn't care about because it was going to get wet on the log ride. And even though it was cooling, it was also kind of icky water. So the whole thought, you know, we used to have kind of a different etiquette. And growing up in the 70s, I even had, the white gloves to wear to church and everything as a little girl. How did people dress to go to the park when it first opened? Do you know?
Yes. They dressed like they were going on a flight or a church. They dressed up. They were not uncommon to see people in suit and tie and everyone else in their best sundress. Not uncommon at all. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to see me out there in pants, wearing shorts, relax. But still, you've seen a bit of I don't want to say necessarily a drop, it's just more of a change in the attitudes. It also is reflective of what's going on outside. It's a lot hotter now than it was back then. So it's a lot more difficult to walk around in a suit and a tie on a hot theme park day in the middle of summer. So that's kind of been more the change, and of course fashion's changed a little bit too, so that's more the reason more than anything else.
And speaking about that, you also reminded me of something else I used to do as a kid. You'll see my shoes that I have on, they've got quite a thick sole. I would always wear my thickest soled shoes so that I could get that extra inch or so to make it onto the coaster.
Well, as a person who sells rides, I would never, ever encourage such behavior for safety reasons, clearly. But yes, and I want to point out something that's kind of interesting, is that just from having this talk about all these old parks and rides, you notice that all these cool memories came up. That's the best part about this industry and about the history of the theme parks, is that they unlock these great memories that we have from years ago. And for me, that's the best part, is to hear stories like that, because I love telling stories, but I also love hearing them. And to unlock them, man, that's a superpower. And these parks can do that. How cool is that?
Okay, so we've got a question back here.
Yes, ma'am.
If you'll hold on just a moment, Kathy.
We used to go to San Marcos, and there was Aquamarine Spring.
Absolutely.
The Pig and the Mermaid and the Submarine.
Ralph the Pig.
What else was there?
So you said Aquamarine is in San Marcos?
Aquamarine Springs.
Aquamarine Springs, San Marcos. And what was the name of the pig?
Ralph the Swimming Pig.
Ralph the Swimming Pig. Okay.
They had an Intamin observation tower and then the long roll.
Okay. So we're talking about one of the parks in San Marcos, Aquamarine, and some of its interesting and very unique attractions, one that was out there in the day. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I didn't actually know about that one now. So now, but these guys immediately were like, oh yeah, we got that. So now I get to look up that one now and find out a bit more about that too. It's like a treasure hunt. When I used to do the old TV show back home, at Old Home, this is New Home. I got here as soon as I could, guys. It was like peeling an onion that smelled really good, because every time you would find a different layer, you'd find another park that, oh, I didn't know about that. Or I would drive by this exit that said Santa's Village Road on the way to the Santa Cruz Boardwalk. What is Santa's Village? Turns out it was this amazing, Christmas-themed amusement park that was there for 20 years. And there was one piece of it that was still left. And we just happened to find it. So, and there is an episode. I'm not going to tell you where to find it, because I don't want you. No, I want you to. If you go on YouTube, you look up Santa's Village, and you look up my name, you will see me looking like an idiot in a Santa suit on a freeway overpass, waving and causing a huge traffic jam on Santa's Village Road. Can you imagine how tripped out those people were driving on that day?
One more question, and this is kind of for the, one question here, it's kind of for the Fort Worth historians too.
Yeah.
You did not mention Lake Erie in your presentation, and I'm thinking of the pictures I've seen of Lake Erie, and I can't say that I remember seeing a roller coaster in the pictures. Were you aware of that? Does anyone else remember?
Yeah.
Was there a roller coaster?
So they're talking about Lake Erie, which is one of the parks that we were unable to put in this presentation.
I didn't know if it had one, and you didn't mention it, because it would be similar to Lake Como.
Yeah, so I wasn't able to find a whole lot on that one. I did want to try and focus a bit more on the ride aspect of it, but I do know that the park existed, but I don't know necessarily, like, in terms of major attractions, what they may have had from my research on it. But with this sort of thing, this could be something where we find out about something on a sheet of paper that's somewhere in the archives, right? Like this industry has lost a lot of history, and part of that is trying to recover it. Sometimes all it takes is just one photo that's not even labeled by that. At the old show, we found an amusement park that everyone had basically forgotten about, Coyote Point, which is just south of San Francisco International. And it turns out that one photo led to several others that gave us an incredible story about why that park closed. It was raw sewage. The park was right next to where the drainage ditch was in the 1920s. So that wonderful $1 million beach, yeah, not so great. So, but again, not to sidetrack you on that, the part of that is trying to unearth and find those smaller parks. So that's part of my research, is to continue to find them more. So I will definitely look into it, though, for sure.
Okay, real quick before we take this next question, we've got a comment
Oh.
from one of our Zoomers saying the log ride, it was just as much fun standing on the side waiting to get drenched when the cars came down as it was riding in the cars, and I agree.
Absolutely.
Okay, did you have a question? Okay.
I don't know if you were aware of this, but when I first got here back in the 80s, at the Fort Worth, they had Lockheed Martin had a recreational center on Humans, on River Street, and a big park below it. And in that park, they had a lot of small-scale rides, and these rides were all made by, what I was told, by the factory workers. So they were all very unique cart-looking stuff. And now that place has all been turned into a shopping center and apartments and stuff. But there is still a small grassy area just south of Whole Foods, between that and the other stores, that has some of those carts that they put up as decorations around the area. You can see how they were handmade, not just look standard. They had really cool decorations on them. So if you get a chance to go by Whole Foods, just take a look at that little park area there. See them.
Absolutely. So the question was more of a comment about, there is a small park that was actually built by Lockheed workers right there by the plant, and that there's still some pieces of it that you can see specifically there by the Whole Foods that's in the area. So yes, absolutely, I will happily go out there. And in fact, might be bringing a few friends, it sounds like, too, to go see it too.
In answer to the question about Lake Erie Park, I believe that was also Lake Como Park. I think it had two names at one time.
No, separate. They're different.
They're different?
They're different. They're making a discussion about Lake Erie and Lake Como Park.
I just don't recall seeing a picture with
A big ride. Yeah, it probably necessarily didn't have that, but I do want to point something out that's fascinating, and this always happens with presentations like this, is that we're having discussions and all these memories are starting to flood and get unlocked again. To me, this is like gold. This is the greatest part about this.
Can you pull your picture back up, that gives you a point of reference that you can see today?
Okay, so for the Zoomers there, one of the things that we're looking at right here, and I'm going to try and circle it again, you see that little tower right there, and that tower is actually part of the power line, which is still there, but was actually more like, because it was built by a windmill company as opposed to necessarily a power company.
You can Google that name. You can find stuff.
What's the name again, just so I can get
You would
repeat it?
have to go out and look at the plaque itself.
Okay. So there's a plaque out there then, Zoomers, that you can check out. Google that information from there, and you can learn all about that. Again, all the cool little tidbits that you find out as you go through talk to these presentations. It's the best. It really is. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? Oh, and
One last one right back there.
Is Schlitterbahn still family-owned, or has it been corporatized?
No, Schlitterbahn is
Do
now.
they have any roller coasters there, or is it all just water?
It's all water rides, and Schlitterbahn was purchased by Cedar Fair, same people that own Cedar Point, Worlds of Fun, 2 years ago? Kings Island.
2017.
It's been a while. So the question was, is Schlitterbahn still a family-owned institution? No, it's actually owned by Cedar Fair, same company that owns Kings Island, Knott's Berry Farm, among several others. So, and eventually that is going to become part of the Six Flags family, because Six Flags is merging with Cedar Fair. So they'll all just be one big happy family. So potentially, we'll see if that happens. Well, yeah. Thank you guys again so much, Rich. Really appreciate it. Oh, there's another question?
Wrap up, I've got one more question.
It's the car club. Yeah, the car club used to rent the Lockheed Park for picnics.
Yes.
Cool.
Back on on the whole thing about it being hot and getting wet on the log ride also reminded me of the air-conditioned rides such as the Spelunker's Cave and the Roto Disco. I'm thinking there's one other from that era, but I can't think of what it was. But do you have any information on the trend of air-conditioned roller coaster rides?
Not as many as they used to have. They, any indoor stuff tends to be air conditioned, but a lot of roller coasters now, they're outdoor platforms, they're not necessarily enclosed. So outside of a Disney park, you're not going to actually see them air conditioned as much as they used to do.
The first theme park that had air conditioning in its queue lines.
That's true. Astroworld was the first park that actually had air conditioning inside of its queue. And in fact, actually in the Picnic Grove, they had air conditioning coming through some of the tables because it's just a little hot in Houston sometimes. And a little humid as well.
It wasn't air conditioning.
Yeah.
Not related to air conditioning, but Six Flags needed to come up with a way to have cold water in its water fountains. And you didn't have Freon water fountains back then. So all the water fountains were just concrete water fountains, but the pipes that fed the fountains were open. And the park would drive around and dump ice into the pits to chill the pipes that fed these concrete water fountains. So Six Flags Over Texas had chilled water in all their water fountains without having Freon-fed water fountains. So that was another first for any amusement park anywhere, was chilled water in their water fountains.
And the park still to this day only uses one ice station. They drive around ice, but they have one giant ice room that's in the back of the park that they package all their ice in and then dry them out throughout the park because it's easier to do that than it is to have to maintain each individual single ice station.
In the late 60s, Six Flags Over Texas also had some air-conditioned outdoor queue lines in buildings, but by the time that the energy crisis hit in the early 70s, they stopped running them. So,
Makes sense. They were pretty inefficient for their day, to say the least. So, what's that? They were, weren't they? Oh, the Zoomer is saying that back in the day, all the Six Flags tend to have the outdoor air conditioning in their stations and in their queue lines, but the energy crisis pretty much put a damper on that and really necessarily returned after that, considering just how archaic the technology was at the time compared to what it is today. So.
And we have a Zoom comment that 60 years ago, the caves were for kissing. Now it would take too much lighting.
No comment.
All right, thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you guys, appreciate you.